Love is a seed that can bloom in the harshest desert, but hatred is a poison that can turn the richest soil to dust. The heart knows which one to water. The scent of hay and horses was thick in the barn, a familiar comfort that was suddenly shattered. Amos Blackwood stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the afternoon light. His face, usually weathered into a stern but familiar mask, was twisted with a cold fury he had never shown his daughter. Eliza stood frozen, her hand still resting on the arm of Nokona, the warrior whose quiet strength had captured her heart. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the three of them, a space filled with unspoken words and the terrible promise of violence. Amos's eyes, chips of ice, were fixed on Nokona, ignoring his own child completely. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to snap. Amos took a slow step into the barn, his boots heavy on the dusty floorboards. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The menace radiated from him, a chilling wave that made Eliza's blood run cold. "Get away from him, daughter," he said, his voice dangerously low. Nokona moved slightly, placing himself more fully in front of Eliza, a silent shield. That small movement was all it took. Amos's hand moved with practiced speed, drawing the heavy firearm from his belt. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back echoed in the sudden stillness. "I gave you a good life," Amos said, his words aimed at Eliza but his gaze locked on Nokona. "And this is how you repay me." The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The smell of gunpowder instantly overwhelmed the scent of hay. Eliza screamed as Nokona staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on the front of his deerskin shirt. He looked at her, his eyes wide with shock and a pain that was not just physical, before he collapsed into the straw. Amos moved then, grabbing Eliza by the arm with a grip of iron. He pulled her away from the fallen warrior, his face unreadable. "You have brought shame upon this house," he stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. He dragged her from the barn, leaving Nokona motionless on the floor, the afternoon light casting long shadows around his still form. Darkness fell, but Amos did not bring a lamp. He returned to the barn with a pair of sheep shears in one hand and a thick rope in the other. Eliza shrank back, but there was nowhere to run. He grabbed a fistful of her long, golden hair, the hair he had once told her was her crowning glory. The shears rasped as they cut through the locks, each snip a fresh wave of violation. Her hair fell around her in a pale pool on the dirty floor. He then bound her wrists and ankles tightly, his movements efficient and cold. He left her there, tied and shorn, in the suffocating darkness next to the man she loved, alone with her grief and the chilling silence of the dead. The night was an eternity of cold and darkness. Eliza lay on the rough floor of the barn, the ropes biting into her skin. Each breath was a painful reminder of what she had lost. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy blanket that smothered all hope. She strained her ears, praying to hear a breath, a groan, anything to prove that Nokona was still with her. But there was nothing. Only the scuttling of mice in the hay and the mournful sigh of the wind outside. Grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She was alone, truly alone, and the despair was a bottomless pit threatening to swallow her whole. The first hint of dawn brought no comfort, only a sliver of gray light that revealed the grim reality of the barn. The door creaked open, and her father's silhouette filled the space. He did not speak a word to her. His eyes, when they met hers, were empty of recognition, as if she were a stranger or a piece of furniture. He walked over to Nokona's body and, with a grunt of effort, lifted the warrior's limp form over his shoulder. He carried him out to the waiting wagon, his movements methodical and unhurried. He returned for Eliza, untying her feet just enough for her to stumble after him, her hands still bound tightly behind her back. The journey was a silent torment. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down with merciless intensity. The wheels of the wagon groaned as they rolled deeper into the arid wilderness, leaving the familiar landscape of the ranch far behind. Eliza sat in the back of the wagon, the rough wooden planks jarring her bruised body. She looked at Nokona's still form lying beside her, his face peaceful in a way that broke her heart anew. Her father sat at the front, his back rigid, a stranger driving them towards an unknown fate. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with dust and the promise of death. There was no water, no shade, only the endless expanse of the desert. Amos finally pulled the horses to a halt in a desolate valley, surrounded by sun-baked rocks and skeletal cacti. The silence here was profound, broken only by the buzzing of flies. He got down from the wagon and, with grim efficiency, unloaded his cargo. He rolled Nakona's body onto the scorching sand, then pulled Eliza down beside him. He looked down at them, his face a mask of cold righteousness. "Let the buzzards cleanse this family's honor," he said, his voice flat and final. He climbed back onto the wagon without a backward glance, leaving them to the elements. The sound of the retreating wagon wheels was the sound of her world ending. The sun was a hammer, beating down on Eliza as she lay on the burning sand. The ropes on her wrists were a constant, agonizing friction against her raw skin. Thirst was a fire in her throat. Despair was a tempting coolness, a whisper that told her to close her eyes and let the end come. But then a glint of light caught her eye. A few feet away, half buried in the sand, was a piece of flint, its edge sharp and promising. A tiny, defiant spark of hope flickered to life within her. She would not die like this. She would not let her father's cruelty be the end of her story. She began to move, slowly, painfully, towards the stone. Every movement was a trial. She pushed with her feet, wriggling her body across the abrasive sand, her bound hands trailing uselessly behind her. The effort left her breathless, her muscles screaming in protest. Finally, her fingers brushed against the cool, sharp edge of the flint. Awkwardly, she maneuvered the stone, trying to get an angle on the ropes that held her captive. She began to saw at the thick fibers, her movements clumsy and desperate. The rope frayed slowly, strand by strand. Her skin tore, and blood mingled with the dust. But she did not stop. Her focus narrowed to the single task of freeing herself. With a final, ragged pull, the rope gave way. Her hands were free. Ignoring the pain in her wrists, she scrambled to Nakona's side. She touched his cheek, expecting the cold, waxy feel of death. Instead, his skin was hot, feverish. She pressed her ear to his chest, her heart pounding in her throat. And then she heard it, a faint, shallow breath, a flutter of life in the vast, dead silence of the desert. He was alive. The realization crashed over her, a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. Hope, fierce and bright, surged through her veins, chasing away the shadows of despair. "Nakona," she whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. She cradled his head in her lap, trying to shield his face from the relentless sun. "Nakona, please." His eyelids fluttered. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, they opened. His eyes were clouded with pain and fever, but they found her. Recognition dawned slowly. He tried to speak, his lips dry and cracked. A faint, raspy sound emerged. "My people," he whispered, his breath catching. He lifted a weak hand and pointed. "North." The red canyons north. His eyes closed again, his strength gone. But he had given her a direction. He had given her a purpose. She had to do something about his wound. Tearing a strip from the hem of her ruined dress, she gently wiped away the dried blood and dust from his chest. The bullet hole was angry and inflamed, a stark, dark circle against his skin. He was burning with fever, his body radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the sun above. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would not survive long without proper care. The bullet was still inside him, a piece of her father's hatred poisoning him from within. They had to move, they had to find help, and they had to do it now. "We have to go," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "You have to get up." Getting him to his feet was a monumental task. He was weak, his body limp and unresponsive. She put her shoulder under his arm, straining with all her might, her small frame trembling with the effort. He groaned, a low sound of pure agony, but he tried to help, pushing with his legs. Together they managed to rise, staggering under the oppressive sun. He leaned on her, his weight a heavy burden, but one she accepted without hesitation. Each step was a victory, a small act of defiance against the desert and the man who had left them there to die. The world was a shimmering haze of heat and light. The red canyons Nokona had spoken of were a faint, distant smudge on the horizon. They seemed impossibly far away. But Nokona, even in his delirium, was her guide. He would stir, his eyes barely open, and point with a trembling finger. "That rock shaped like a hawk," he would rasp. "We go left of it." He knew this land. It was a part of him. He read the signs she could not see. The subtle shifts in the landscape, the position of the sun. He was the compass, and she was the strength that kept them moving, one agonizing step at a time, across the unforgiving terrain. They had been walking for hours. Eliza's hope was beginning to fray, her strength failing. The canyons seemed no closer. And then she saw it, a dark shape on the horizon, moving towards them. It was not a mirage. It was a rider on a horse. Fear clenched her heart. Was it one of her father's men, sent to finish the job? As the rider drew closer, she saw the man's dark braided hair and the familiar patterns on his clothing. He was one of Nokona's people. The rider spurred his horse, his face a mask of alarm as he recognized the wounded warrior and the desperate girl holding him up. Salvation had found them in the heart of the wasteland. The hunter's name was Hinto. He dismounted quickly, his face etched with concern. He spoke to Nokona in their native tongue, his voice gentle. With surprising strength, he lifted the wounded warrior onto his horse, then helped Eliza up behind him. The ride to the camp was a blur for Eliza, her exhaustion complete. They arrived in a hidden canyon, where lodges were nestled amongst the rocks. People emerged, their faces showing alarm at the sight of Nokona, and a guarded suspicion as they looked at Eliza. An elder woman with kind eyes came forward and helped her dismount, leading her towards a fire while the men carried Nokona to a medicine lodge. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with the smell of burning sage and herbs. The medicine man, a figure of quiet authority, worked over Nokona, chanting in a low, rhythmic voice. He cleaned the wound and applied a poultice, his movements ancient and practiced. But after a long examination, he shook his head gravely. He spoke to the elders, and though Eliza could not understand the words, she understood the gestures. The lead was too deep. His magic was for the ills of the spirit and the flesh, but not for the metal of the white man. Without its removal, the poison would spread. Nokona would die. A council was held. The elders spoke in hushed, serious tones. Eliza stood apart, feeling the weight of their stares. She was the cause of this, the outsider who had brought this trouble. Then, one of the elders turned to her. He spoke of a doctor in the town of Redemption. He was known to be a fair man, one who had treated their people before. It was a great risk. To take Nokona into a white town was to invite danger, but it was his only chance. "Please," Eliza said, her voice trembling but firm, "let me take him. I will not let him die." Her plea, born of love and desperation, seemed to sway them. Hinto volunteered to be their guide. He knew the way to Redemption and the location of the doctor's house. They waited for the sun to set, for the cover of darkness to hide their passage. They fashioned a travois, a simple sled pulled by a horse, to carry Nokona, who was now lost in a fever dream, muttering incomprehensibly. As they set out under a sky full of stars, Eliza felt a renewed sense of dread. They were leaving the only sanctuary they had, venturing into the world that had tried to kill them, placing their faith in the slim hope that one good man could make a difference. Dr. Albright's house was the only one in Redemption, with a light still burning in the window. Hinto knocked softly on the door. It was opened by a man with weary eyes, graying hair, and hands stained with medicine. He looked at the wounded man on the travois, at the anxious girl, and at the stoic warrior beside her. He did not ask for explanations. He simply saw a person in desperate need of his help. "Bring him inside," Dr. Albright said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Quickly now." He led them to a clean room at the back of his house, which served as his surgery. The next hour was a blur of tension and fear for Eliza. She watched as Dr. Albright worked under the bright, steady light of an oil lamp. He cleaned the wound with carbolic acid and laid out his gleaming instruments. He gave Nocona a cloth soaked in chloroform to dull the pain. Eliza held Nocona's hand, her own trembling, whispering words of encouragement he could not hear. The doctor probed the wound with a delicate touch, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was a soft metallic scrape, and then he held up a small, misshapen piece of lead in his forceps. "He will be fine," the doctor said, finally allowing a tired smile. "The worst is over." While Nocona slept, his breathing finally deep and even, Dr. Albright poured 2 glasses of water. He sat with Eliza in his small study, the shelves lined with books. He listened patiently as she told him the whole story, from the secret meetings in the barn to the abandonment in the desert. She did not cry. Her voice was steady, filled with a cold, hard anger. The doctor listened without interruption, his expression growing more somber with each detail. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "What your father did," he said at last, his voice quiet but firm, "is not just a sin, it is a crime, attempted murder." The following morning, Dr. Albright went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a practical man, weathered by years of trying to keep the peace on a lawless frontier. He listened to the doctor's story, swirling the dregs of his coffee in his cup. He had known Amos Blackwood for years. He was a hard man, but respected. Brody sighed. He was tired of the violence, tired of the hatred. But the law was the law. The doctor's testimony was compelling, and the evidence of the bullet was undeniable. He stood up, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor, and reached for the worn leather belt holding his firearm. He had a duty to perform. Sheriff Brody found Amos Blackwood at his ranch, just as the doctor said he would be. He was repairing a fence line, his movements steady and deliberate, as if it were just another ordinary day. He looked up as the sheriff approached, his expression unreadable. He did not seem surprised to see the lawman. "Amos," Brody said, keeping his voice even, "I am placing you under arrest for the attempted murder of a man and the endangerment of your daughter." Amos slowly put down his hammer. He offered no resistance as the sheriff bound his wrists, his gaze distant and cold, as if he were already planning his next move. In town, Amos's story was very different. He stood before the circuit judge, his voice ringing with false sincerity. He painted a picture of a concerned father protecting his only child. He claimed Nocona was a thief, a savage from the hills who had been filling Eliza's head with lies, trying to lure her away. He said he had caught the man trying to abduct her and had only acted to defend his property and his daughter's honor. The townsfolk who gathered to watch were divided. Some saw a righteous father, while others saw a cruel tyrant. The truth became murky, lost in a cloud of prejudice and fear. That evening, Amos received a visitor in his cell. It was Judge Hemlock, a man whose robes hid a corrupt heart. Their conversation was brief and quiet. A heavy purse of gold was discreetly passed through the bars. The next morning, Judge Hemlock entered the courtroom and banged his gavel. He declared that, without the testimony of the alleged victim, who was a known savage, and with only the word of a hysterical girl, there was no credible evidence of a crime. He dismissed all charges. Amos Blackwood walked out of the courthouse a free man, a smug look of triumph on his face. Dr. Albright brought the news to Eliza and Nocona, who was slowly recovering his strength. The doctor's face was grim. The injustice of it all was a heavy blow. They had risked everything to seek the white man's law, only to find it was for sale. Eliza knew her father. He would not let this go. His freedom meant their lives were in more danger than ever before. There was no safety for them in redemption. As Nocona took his first unsteady steps, they both knew what they had to do. They had to return to the hidden canyon, to the only people they could trust, and prepare for the storm that was surely coming. Amos Blackwood stood on the porch of his ranch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. But he felt no peace. His release from jail was not a victory, but merely a delay. The warrior had survived. His daughter had defied him. They were still out there, a living testament to his perceived shame. The whispers in town, the sideways glances, they all fueled the fire of his rage. He would not be judged by his peers or shamed by his own blood. He needed a permanent solution. He needed to erase the problem, and for that, He needed men who were not afraid of the dark. He rode to a saloon on the edge of town, a place where the whiskey was cheap and men's souls were cheaper. The air was thick with smoke and the low murmur of dangerous conversations. He found the man he was looking for in a back corner, playing cards. His name was Corbin, a gunslinger with a reputation for being as deadly as he was reliable. Amos laid a heavy bag of coins on the table. "I have a job for you," Amos said, his voice low. "Two people, a man and a woman. I want them gone. No witnesses, no traces." Corbin looked from the bag to Amos's cold eyes and gave a slow, predatory smile. Corbin gathered his crew, 5 other men who were as ruthless as he was. They were hard-bitten men, their faces maps of past violences, their hands never far from the firearms at their hips. They asked few questions, caring only about the gold they were promised. They rode out the next morning, following the trail towards the tribal lands. They were skilled trackers, accustomed to hunting men in the wilderness. They moved with a quiet purpose, their presence a dark shadow moving across the landscape, drawing ever closer to the unsuspecting camp in the Red Canyons. In the camp, life had found a fragile rhythm. Nokona was healing, the bond between him and Eliza deepening with each passing day. But a scout, sent to watch the trails, returned with urgent news. He had seen 6 riders, heavily armed, moving with the unmistakable intent of hunters. He described them perfectly. Nokona knew at once they were not a random patrol or lost cowboys. They were hunting for him and Eliza. He looked at the faces of his people, the children playing, the elders telling stories. He could not let his fight become their massacre. He and Eliza had to leave. They had to draw the fire away from his home. The decision was a painful one. Leaving the safety of the camp felt like a betrayal, but staying would doom everyone. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Nokona and Eliza slipped away. They took 2 horses and enough supplies for a few days. Their plan was desperate. They would ride to Silver Creek, a larger town to the north, and seek the help of the federal marshals. It was a long shot, a gamble on a law that had already failed them once, but it was the only chance they had to stop the wave of violence that was about to crash down on Nokona's people. They rode hard, pushing their horses, knowing that Corbin and his men were not far behind. Silver Creek was a bustling hub, a place where the law was said to have a longer reach. They found the office of Federal Marshal Reed. He was a tall, imposing man with a stern face and eyes that seemed to see right through you. He listened to their story without a word, his expression unreadable. His gaze lingered on Nokona, filled with a deep-seated distrust that was common in these parts. "I have heard many tales from your kind," the marshal said when they had finished, his voice a low rumble. "Usually about stolen land or broken treaties. This is different. You are asking me to ride against hired guns on your word alone." Before Nokona could speak, Eliza stepped forward. She looked the marshal directly in the eye, her fear overshadowed by her fierce resolve. "My name is Eliza Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My father is Amos Blackwood. He tried to murder this man, and he left us both to die in the desert. Now he has hired men to finish the job, and they will kill everyone in that camp to do it." "I am not asking you to believe him," she said, gesturing to Nokona. "I am asking you to believe me." The marshal studied her face, searching for any hint of deception. He saw only the raw, unvarnished truth of a woman fighting for her life and the lives of others. Marshal Reed was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him the girl was not lying. He made his decision. "All right," he said, his voice decisive. "I will ride with you. I will take 3 of my deputies." He then turned his hard gaze on Nokona. "But hear me now. If this is a trick, if your people are waiting to ambush us, or if any part of this story is a lie, I will see you hang from the highest tree in this territory myself." He did not wait for a reply, instead turning to shout for his men. The desperate gamble had paid off. For now, they rode without stopping, the marshal and his deputies pushing their horses to the limit. They understood the urgency. They arrived at the canyon entrance just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the rocks. Nokona quickly explained the layout of the camp. Marshal Reed was a veteran of many such conflicts. He swiftly positioned his men in the rocks, overlooking the main approach, their rifles ready. The camp itself was made to look quiet, almost deserted. The women and children were hidden away. The warriors waited, silent and unseen. The air grew thick with a tense, heavy silence. Corbin and his gang rode into the canyon with arrogant confidence. They saw the quiet camp and assumed their arrival was a surprise. They spread out, their firearms drawn, ready to begin their bloody work. They were halfway to the central fire when Marshal Reed's voice boomed from the rocks above. "Federal marshals, you are surrounded. Drop your weapons." For a heartbeat, the gunslingers were frozen in shock. Then, instinct took over. They went for their firearms, trying to find cover. But it was too late. The canyon erupted in a deafening volley of rifle fire. The fight was over almost as soon as it began. The deputies were expert marksmen, and their ambush was perfectly executed. The gunslingers were caught in a deadly crossfire, with nowhere to run. One by one they fell. The sharp crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls, a grim drumbeat, marking the end of the hunt. When the gun smoke finally began to clear, 5 of the hired guns lay still on the ground. The 6th, their leader Corbin, stood alone in the center of the camp, his firearm empty, his face pale, with the sudden realization that he was not going to be paid. He was going to be captured. Faced with the marshal's cold stare and the prospect of a hangman's noose, Corbin's loyalty to Amos Blackwood evaporated. He talked. He told them everything, confessing to the murder-for-hire plot and implicating both Amos and the corrupt Judge Hemlock. With his testimony, Marshal Reed had everything he needed. Amos and the judge were arrested, and this time, there was no escape. Amos was sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor in a federal prison. Nocona and Eliza were finally free from the shadow of his hatred. They were married in the camp, their union a symbol of a love that had conquered prejudice and violence. They built a life together, and their children were born into a world made a little brighter by their parents' courage.